Hi, I'm Bryce Crittenden.
Hi, I'm Caroline Land, and welcome back to EPL's Overdue Finds.
Caroline, how are you today?
I'm doing well, Bryce. How are you?
Good. We're recording on Monday morning again, but did you have a good weekend?
Yes, it was nice. It was Mother's Day, so I got to check in with my mom and have a phone call. Yeah, what about you? Did you have a good weekend?
I did. Yeah, it was really good. I got to call my mom as well. And happy belated Mother's Day to all those moms out there. And we hope you enjoyed our last episode where we talked about the best and worst parents in pop culture. So it looks like we had lots of downloads on that episode. So thank you to everyone who listened to it. Today, though, we're doing something a little bit different. It's a topic we haven't really covered here on Overdue Finds, and that's the idea of crafting and more specifically like pop culture crafting. So Caroline, before we get into it and introduce our guests, are you a crafting person? Because big shock, I am not.
I would not say that I am. I am enthusiastic about the idea of it. Sometimes I decide to start a project, and if it gets finished or not, is that really the point?
It's good though, because today we've got, I want to say, a couple of experts joining us today to chat all about pop culture crafting, and then also some of the resources within our catalog or collection here at EPL that people can use at home. First of all, of course, we want to welcome to the show. She's a member of the Overdue Finds family, which Caroline has has come up with. Editor extraordinaire and occasional co-host, Meg DeForest. Meg, how are you today?
I am great and very excited that we're getting into the crafty side of pop culture. It's definitely my jam, so this is going to be fun.
And also joining us today, this guest was just recently on our Moana episode, so 2 episodes ago. And fun fact, this episode was actually her idea. Welcome back to the show, Ashley Dotto. Ashley, how are you today?
I'm good. How are you?
Really good, thanks. It was funny because when you I think it was like that same day after we finished recording our Moana episode, we got an email from you saying, "Oh, thanks for having me on." And you're like, "Hey, if you're looking for any episode ideas, what about this?" The idea of like pop culture crafting. So did that just kind of come to you immediately after we were done talking then?
I think it was a kind of a crossing of a bunch of stuff. So you wander into the workroom and you see what people are getting for holds. And I think there was a box of new books, a bin of new books. And there was a knitting Star Wars book, like an official book. We've been seeing a lot of that. And I belong to a couple crafting groups on Facebook, and something you see pop up a lot is the Outlander knitting book, which is a little bit different in that you're recreating pieces from Outlander, not making little creatures and stuff. Yeah, and I think I kind of just looked down at my own knitting, which I had with me on lunch, and was like, "Oh yeah, this is something that comes up." And coincidentally, a crochet podcast that I listened to then had an episode about crochet in pop culture and television. So that was really interesting, actually.
Yeah, you were like, this has to be an Overdue Finds episode, and here we are.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we're glad Caroline and I didn't scare you off after recording that Moana episode, so we're so happy to have you back joining us today. Before we get into our Overdue Finds, though, a couple quick shout outs or mentions I just want to quickly get to. First is we just saw on this past Friday, anyway, received an email that Overdue Finds is nominated for another Canadian Podcast Award. We are nominated in the category of Best Artwork. So yeah, of course, we last won in 2019 for Best Branded Series, and now we're up for Best Artwork. Caroline, I was really excited to see that email.
It was really exciting to see that come in. I want to give a mention to the people who designed the artwork.
Yeah, our design team here at EPL, of course, came up with that. They do awesome work, so a lot of the stuff pretty much 99% of the stuff that you see on our website is all from our amazingly talented design team. So quick shout out to Craig, Gina, and Gabby from marketing's design and creative team for coming up with that artwork. So big thanks to all of them and all the hard work that they do. So if you do have your own podcast, you can actually go online and vote for Overdue Finds. So you can visit, it's canpodawards.ca/vote, and you can vote before May 29th. And of course, we're up for best artwork, but there's also a lot of other Canadian series, various categories that you can also go and vote for. So make sure you go check that out. And thank you to everyone who nominated us.
There were a few other Edmonton nominees as well. And once again, it's just really exciting to be a part of this podcasting community in Edmonton. We don't always tell super local stories, but it's an opportunity to showcase where we are, and we can do things like the episode that we did last year on the NHL bubble.
Exactly. And then, Caroline, I know you were really excited about this one too. We also received a shout out from Public Libraries Online, which included Overdue Finds on their list of what's new in library podcasts. And we were included in the Reader's Advisory section.
I was scrolling through the article, not sure kind of where we might appear on it or how they might classify us. But when I saw us under Reader's Advisory, I thought, we do. That's really the heart of what the podcast is, talking about what is in our collection and who might enjoy it.
One quick line I just want to mention here. I know you were excited about this on Twitter. They said, so Overdue Finds from Edmonton Public Library in Canada dishes on books, movies, music, and pop culture. You really loved that dishes line, didn't you?
Exactly. That's been my goal this whole time. And so to have that recognition just really felt pretty special.
So let's get into our recent Overdue Finds. Ashley, what have you been enjoying lately?
Since about Christmas, I've been watching a lot of The Amazing Race. Way back when, probably when it was in single digits, watched a few seasons of it when it was current on TV, but I hadn't really kept up with it at all. And around Christmas, I just needed something relatively mindless that I could put it on in the background and either watch it or not watch it. And you can get invested in who's in it or not at all. And it's kind of soothing in its rhythms and predictability. There's over 30 seasons now, and EPL has all but a couple from the beginning. And I'm sure we had them at some point and they just weren't replaceable when they were discarded. So pretty interesting to see how it evolves over time. I'm 25 seasons in-ish, which is a lot, but yeah, you can watch the whole thing in a weekend easily. And the evolution of it, but also how they pick who's on it. So for, I guess, people who have never watched The Amazing Race and don't know how it works, it's 11 pairs going around the world, not probably seeing much of the world while they're doing these challenges. And they try and build some cultural stuff in there, but sometimes you're like, no, they're just taking what they can get. And generally they hit 5 or 6 different continents with it. So it's a lot of air travel and a lot of car travel and getting lost. And fighting, and I'm sure they're tired most of the time. And early seasons, they seem to pick. So there's couples, like romantic couples, and there's friends, and there's family members, that kind of thing. And especially early on, they seem to pick for the most competitive, which often ended up meaning like the most toxic relationships. And there were some really uncomfortable moments in some early seasons where I'm like, you should not be together. Like, this is, if not abusive, it's definitely not good for either of you to be in this relationship.
Yeah, it's like you won't even get a chance to leave North America before your relationship is toast on this show. Meg, how about you? What have you been enjoying lately?
I have admitted my D&D love earlier on this podcast, and one of the things that I have been spending part of my pandemic doing is catching up on Critical Role, which I don't know if anybody has heard of, but it's a Twitch show about D&D, and it's like I'm so far behind. I don't know that I'll ever catch up, even though I've been trying. Like, they do an episode a week, but each episode is 4 hours. They're on their second campaign, and they have 130 something episodes, and I'm like 40 behind. So it's definitely like the opposite of Ashley's. You can watch it in a weekend. This is like a long-term relationship that you have with this show. And so I have been trying to catch up, but the library actually has some really great supplemental materials. And so I was sort of looking for something else to do while I'm trying to catch up. And we have a really beautiful art book called The World of Critical Role. And it's kind of interesting because I think it really fits into this episode, because it's all fans of the show who do like drawings of the characters that come up in the campaign and submit them. And it's a beautiful book. It also has like discussions from the actors who take part in it about like how they got into D&D and like why do they like this form of storytelling. So I think that part is also just interesting for people who either you love D&D or you don't know why anybody would like it. Like, it sort of works for either side. If you're a big into the history of it, you can sort of see how people have, these bigger names have gotten into it, but also it has these just beautiful art that people have sort of dedicated to it because they really love watching the show. And so we also have on Hoopla from their first campaign, there's some graphic novels about the origins of the characters so there's really beautiful Vox Machina origins on Hoopla. So I've been reading those graphic novels.
That's awesome. It's funny you mentioned that because when the day that we're recording this, we just had our very first weekly 3 video come out. So we had friend of the podcast, Kate Gibson. Her first weekly 3 video was on Dungeons and Dragons. We'll have a link to that. It's on our YouTube channel as well. So Caroline, how about you? What have you been enjoying lately?
I have been talking about movies a lot lately. So this week I thought I would switch over to a book that I read and enjoyed recently. It was called Beach Read by Emily Henry. And I fell in love with the premise of this book, which was that January Andrews is a romance writer who is incapable of writing anything that does not have a happily ever after. However, something has happened to her recently that's shaken her faith in love. And she moves into a cottage for the summer to try to put her life back together. Next door, she discovers, who is it? Augustus Everett, a writer of literary fiction who she kind of has a past with. Now, he is her complete opposite. His characters all like die at the end of the story. No one ends up happy. And she says, what are you doing? And he says, it's more realistic, all of this. And so they make a bet with each other that summer, by the end of the summer, he will have written a book that has a happily ever after ending, and she will have written something that fits under literary fiction. And in order to do that, they're going to write 5 days a week. And then on the 6th and 7th day, each one is going to introduce the other one, to the world that they are writing in. So she is going to, show him picnics and hot air balloon rides. And he is going to go and show her how he does his in-depth research on, cult survivors. The only thing he says is she has to promise not to fall in love with him.
This sounds like a great Hallmark, not even a Hallmark Christmas movie, just a Hallmark movie,
yes,
romantic comedy.
Exactly. This is like a Hallmark, Labor Day weekend movie that you would want to watch.
Yes. Yeah, it's part of their spring fling collection or whatever it's called. Yeah.
Exactly. In this, it's set in kind of this small cottagey town. There's all kinds of colorful side characters. You learn more about her past as she is going through something and why she's in this beach cottage, why he's living next door, all of these things. It was fun. It was for me, it fit into my category of what I call my lunchtime book, which is a book that I read on my lunch hour that has to be engaging enough to really grab me. Because some days I'll just work right through lunch. And if I have a book that I want to stop and read, that's helpful for reminding me to take a break, take some time, do some self-care. And this book was perfect because every time I would read it on my lunch hour, it would end at some kind of light cliffhanger, and that would draw me in for the next day.
Well, it sounds like a really fun, light read. And, when you're at work, you like to take our minds elsewhere, where and whenever we can. And sounds like a great book for that. And summer coming up, that sounds like a perfect beach read.
Ooh, well done. Bryce, what have you been enjoying?
So on our last episode, I had recommended a baseball video game, MLB The Show. And maybe it's just because the MLB season has started. Spoiler alert, I do have another baseball themed pick for this episode. I will do my best not to have a baseball themed pick on our next episode, but I'm gonna keep this train going here. Recently, let me go back a little bit. I am a sucker for sports movies, and in particular, baseball movies. So if you're coming out with a baseball movie, there's a 99.9% chance I am going to watch it. And obviously with a lot of these sports movies, of course, there always has the underdog sports team. So, this theme is nothing new, but I think where this theme really started was back in 1976 with the original Bad News Bears, which is my pick this week for you to go and check out. If you think about it, we wouldn't really have movies like The Mighty Ducks or The Sandlot if it wasn't for this classic comedy starring Walter Matthau and Tatum O'Neal. If you're not familiar with the movie, Walter Matthau plays a kind of this down on his luck former baseball player who decides to coach a little league team. Of course, they're filled with kids who, big shock, are not that good at baseball. The movie is hilarious, but I should kind of give warning though to people. It's funny. It's rated PG. It probably shouldn't be. Of course, back in 1976, this was rated PG. But there's a lot of language that is used that is definitely problematic for 2021, and probably shouldn't have been. It was never okay, and definitely wasn't okay back in 1976, but that's the way I guess things were. But if you could look past some of that problematic language, the movie is really funny. Great acting by Walter Matthau, who's perfectly cast here in the role of this kind of washed up ex-baseball player. Tatum O'Neal, who I think is only 13 or 14, does an amazing job, and a young Jackie Earle Haley, who most people might know as from Watchmen movies, who played Rorschach. So yeah, this is a fun baseball movie. It's definitely probably not one you want to watch with the whole family, but if you want to look back at kind of the origins of the underdog sports movie, go check out Bad News Bears. We have it on both DVD and streaming through Hoopla. Caroline, have you watched Bad News Bears?
I don't think I have. I feel like I have, but I don't think I actually have. But there's just something about an underdog sports movie,
Oh, yeah. I'm a sucker for it.
Yeah.
That might have to be a future episode of the podcast, I think.
I'm in.
Underdog sports movies. Yeah.
Today we're talking about making and creating that has been influenced by pop culture. Before we get too deep into the topic, Bryce and I kind of put our cards on the table. How crafty are you? Ashley, we'll start with you.
Complicated question. I like crafts. I don't aside from the ones that I'm really into, I don't do a diverse amount of crafts. I have a couple of friends who will pick up every new trend that comes and be instantly good at it. I knit and crochet. I learned how to do those when I was in university, I think was the last time it was super popular, and I kind of picked it up on a trend and then I continued with it. And then during the pandemic, I had a lot of extra time on my hands and I kind of leveled up and started doing some more complicated things like garments and what else? Using nicer yarns, spending way more money on it. a friend got me a macrame kit for Christmas to make a little wall hanging. So I did that for the first time recently, and it was super fun. So, but other than that, mostly just, knitting and crocheting.
Yeah. Meg, how about you?
I mean, I'm mostly a knitter. I would say similar to Ashley. I started in university because it probably was around the same time that like suddenly it was cool and there was like go to the pub and knit and like complain about classes was like suddenly a thing. I think probably when we were in school. But I do other crafts too. I have a Cricut and I make cards for people. Like that's a big thing that I like to do is like the paper crafts into cards and things like that. And my mom is a gorgeous cross stitch and embroidery person. And so I've tried that as a kid just because that was kind of a thing that happened in my house, but I'm not great at it. But yeah, I think I'm think of myself as pretty crafty. I'll give things something a shot if it's new and interesting. But yeah, I'm mostly a knitter and have done a lot, as I think we'll get into as we sort of talk about what knitting, like kind of crafty things we've maybe done for pop culture. But yeah, I've done a lot of knitting.
So I have to ask, because I've noticed our makerspace has one of these and you just brought up the Cricut. I've seen it listed, like I've seen it obviously on our website and, and also just kind of in the odd store here and there. What exactly is a Cricut for those who might not be aware of what it is?
Yeah, I mean, it's great for somebody like me who is, I had a report card as a small child that says Meg needs to work on her scissor skills because I am not I'm not a neat cutter. So a Cricut basically is a machine where you can take basically like a printer where you take something that you've designed on a computer or your tablet and then you connect it to this printer and it will cut it out with like a precision knife on a vinyl sort of sheet. And so you can do all sorts of stuff depending on the Cricut machine you have. You can even get up to like leather work. So there are people who even make like their own purses or something, like, cause you can cut like leather insets and stuff like that. And, but it can be anything from paper to do cards, and people do great like wreaths and flowers. You can do paper flowers on it that are beautiful. Like you can see it in Milner, some paper flowers that were a part of our grand opening. But it also, one of the things I do that's kind of geeky is for my personal D&D group, I made us all stickers on the Cricut, so you could actually design stickers with vinyl and then peel and stick them. And so I made everybody like commemorative stickers for various events in our D&D game, which is probably the geekiest thing I've admitted in public. But it's a lot of fun.
Nice. Yeah, like I said, I've seen it listed, and I know that, before Milner opened, we were inviting Edmontonians to come down to the library and use the Cricut to make these flowers for one of our walls at the Stanley Milner Library. So, that's cool. Now I know exactly what it is. I probably should have asked earlier, but now I know for sure. So, Caroline, was there, like, I know we both kind of said at the top of the show, like, we're not big crafty people, but do you remember like the last time you like either like tried crafting, or was there anything that really that you can remember?
That's a good question. I do know how to knit, by which I mean I can do a basic knit stitch and like to knit squares, and that's pretty much all I can do. I learned in elementary school. We had a teacher who offered to teach us knitting, and it was cold at recess and I didn't want to go outside. So it seemed like a good trade-off. And the first thing I learned how to make were slippers, a pretty easy pattern of just like you kind of it's hard. My hands are moving around right now, which I know this is not a visual medium, but you just knit kind of like one piece, and then at the end you bring it all together and you have a little slipper. And one thing I did as a child was I was so inspired by the beautiful figure skating costumes I saw on TV and in the books that I had, that I created miniature replicas of some semi-famous figure skating costumes. I've never sewn anything before or after this. I just got it into my head that I was going to recreate Nancy Kerrigan's 1994 Vera Wang Olympic outfit, and I did, and then I stopped. So that kind of sums up my small handwork relationship of I will just kind of dip in and dip out at different times. Have you ever tried knitting, Bryce?
No, but I haven't. But that story that you were mentioning about how, like, when you were growing up in school, it was so cold outside, or, you know, you could stay in and learn to knit. If that had been offered to me at school, I probably would be an excellent knitter right
Yeah.
now, because I was totally the kid where, and I'm still this way. It gets a little bit cold outside. I just don't want to go outside.
That's
So yeah,
true. One thing I can't remember if I shared on the podcast is that you are very good at mapping indoor routes.
It's true. Yes. I jokingly called myself the mayor of the downtown's pedway system, because I could tell you any point downtown how to get to another area just by going inside, like, most of the way. So yeah, I know that's not a craft, but but it was funny though. I was thinking about this before we started recording today, and yeah, I honestly do not remember the last time I did some sort of craft or anything, but I do recall as a child, one year for Christmas, I got a wood burning kit. And so that was fun. It came with these little pieces of wood, and there'd be like a horse on it, and you just had to follow the pattern. And my parents were happy that I didn't burn the house down with it. But yeah, that's probably the last time I was doing any sort of crafting myself. Meg, what role do libraries have in making and creating, and what kind of resources are available through EPL to help people get started?
Well, I think probably people who've been listening to the podcast know how big the makerspace is at Edmonton Public Library, and certainly making culture has been really huge in a lot of libraries. I do think that it's really a great way to get into some of those crafts where you're not able to, you know, I owned a Cricut machine, but that's because I knew I liked it. And, you know, maybe somebody trying it out, it can be pretty expensive to start to get into some of these kinds of crafting things if you're not really sure that you even are going to like it. Or maybe like Caroline, you have one project you want to do and you don't want to buy the equipment to do the one project. And so I do think that the library has a great way of bringing people into those, what can be expensive crafting spaces, and give it a test, see if it's a thing that's for you. But we also have just great resources for people who are already into crafting. One of the ones I think people don't know about enough is Creative Bug, which has like really great videos. I mean, I joke that I learned to knit from YouTube because I sort of went to all these groups and I didn't know what I was doing. And in fact, years later realized I'd been knitting wrong. Like I just learned to stitch in a weird way and I had done it wrong for like 5 years, and until it became a problem and I had to relearn how to do it. But that's not going to be a problem if you learn on our Creative Bug videos, because they are from experts who know what they're doing. And so I do definitely recommend checking that out. And it's not just knitting. Creative Bug has great sewing and all sorts of other kinds of both patterns to get you started if you are somebody who knows what you're doing and you maybe just need a new project, but also some beginner stuff for people who maybe just want to give it a try and you're not really sure where to start.
Ashley, for you, being in the branch, I know it's been over a year since really we've been able to do some like in-branch programming, but Strathcona, did you host like a lot of classes or programs for kids where there would be crafting?
Yeah, we also did a lot of on the floor passive, like you would set up what you needed. So for example, at Summer Starts, the opening day, an easy thing to do is a craft that connects to the theme of the year. And so you would just set out all the materials and some instructions, and then kids could go wild. That discovery play aspect of it too, where they can just make whatever they want and problem solve about how they would put it together, was really interesting and valuable. And then you also would just see random community groups coming in and using the space for crafting. So I know some of the branches have knitting groups that would either rent the program room or would just come and use the space to meet if they were smaller. And it's nice to see that kind of creativity happening. And sometimes it would draw a crowd of people around them who are interested in learning more. And you would see groups mixing that you wouldn't normally see. So it's really nice community building piece.
Picking up on one thing there, I think that when I was putting this outline together for this episode, I sometimes struggled with the language to know, like, what is crafting? What does it involve? Is that a term that's used by the community, all of this? And so I think that the language that's used to describe it can also be an important part of it.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think just thinking about the terms that we've used, but like the difference between crafting and making is often crafting is generally seen as sort of a woman's thing, and maybe it's not as valued, despite the fact, as Ashley was saying, like you can get very expensive yarns, and it can actually be maybe just as expensive as some of the making projects that you would be spending money on the technology for robots or other things. So, and especially in the sort of, since we're talking about the pop culture area, a thing that happens a lot is that cosplay really started as women expressing their love of, you know, Star Trek or Star Wars or any of these like Final Fantasy, you know, any of those kinds of products where they would express their love of this show or this game by creating costumes and sewing and spending hours rewatching segments to get like one obscure costume correct. I mean, even Caroline with your figure skating, like that's cosplay in a way, right? That's that sewing to make something that you love. And a lot of times that's not seen as necessarily as valued as other kinds of participation in geek culture. And I think that's changing now. I think that we've gotten to a point where people realize the skill and effort and money that kind of can go into that. But I do think that there's sometimes that feeling of crafting. And that's certainly something that I think of myself as a crafter, as a knitter. I certainly think about who I give gifts of knitting to. I want to make sure it's somebody who's going to appreciate that it was hours and hours of work that, you know, went into me making something that I thought they would enjoy. And you don't want to do all of that for somebody who sort of thinks, well, I could buy a $20 hat. like, why would you put that effort in? You want to make sure that that's something that people appreciate. And that's, I think some people do, and some people just sort of don't get it. That's not their thing, and that's fine. But it does devalue that work sometimes, I think.
Ashley, you had mentioned that I think you used the phrase you leveled up during the pandemic with your crafting and your making. How has the pandemic played a role in this?
I think part of it was with people being home more. A lot of people were laid off. People just had way more time on their hands. They had time to learn new things or to spend more time on things that they were passionate about. Or they were just looking for something to do. I know, like, I was home 24/7, not going out much, and I had kind of not stopped knitting, but it had become more of a chore for me. I'd gotten out of the habit of doing it. Mostly was just for gifts, especially like baby gifts and stuff like that. And I'd gotten out of touch with what was out there for patterns and stuff. I'd sort of transitioned into digital patterns and getting stuff that way, but not completely. And then the social bit too really upped their game. A lot of like Facebook groups and stuff started. A lot of knit along and crochet along groups. So that's where you're all working on the same pattern or a certain theme of patterns and then posting your progress. So you see a lot more of that. And it's a way to connect with people, even though you're doing a solitary thing.
I think, yeah, one of the things actually that I think is nice about knitting and even sewing is, while it's great to connect both with people now, I always think of it as like how connected I am to previous generations. Like when we're going through the pandemic and things are rough, and I think about like me sitting there doing my knitting, and I think about like during the World War or during the Depression, like people who maybe were doing these crafts not just for a fun distraction, but also like this was a way to like clothe your family, or this was a way to like repurpose fabrics that you had. And so I always think that's kind of an interesting part of crafting too, is that, you know, I can pick up a pattern and I can be connected both to like that tradition, but also it's really cool to knit from other traditions. Like I have a whole knitting book that's mitten patterns from Newfoundland, because there's a really big tradition of like fishermen sweaters and like these particular patterns that are related to that culture. And so I think both we're talking today about knitting and pop culture, but there's also that like representation of actual cultures that you can kind of, you know, you can't visit, but maybe I can like learn about this Japanese knitting style, and I can like figure out a way to like, how is that different than what you would see in Scotland or Ireland, and how did that develop? So I think that's kind of a cool factor about it too.
And connecting with old patterns. And I know a coworker brought in a book of Vogue knitting patterns. The book was from the 80s, and it had patterns that were recreated from Vogue knitting magazine's back catalog back to the 50s or something like that. Then that was really fun to look through. Or my grandparents moved recently, and my grandma gave me all of her yarn and knitting and stuff, and she had a bunch of patterns in there that belonged to her mother, so my great grandma. And it was fun to go through those and look at them and go, okay, some things haven't really changed all that much. Like certain things are evergreen. And then some stuff is like, no, I would never, ever make that. It's not even nice in a retro kitschy way.
And I think that reflects into pop culture, because a recent sweater, I think on The Mandalorian, that made a bit of an impact was that they had, and I don't know, I know Star Wars, but I don't know the name of this creature on The Mandalorian. It was like one of the fish creatures, and he was wearing a fisherman's sweater. Like that's the name of the sweater, is a fisherman's sweater, but they had a fish creature in it. And I think that was sort of like a fun play from like the design team on Star Wars, being like, okay, he's a fish person, he's gonna wear a fisherman's sweater. But I think that there is sometimes that, like, and you talked a bit about Outlander, and I think like the design team of Outlander does a really good job of like trying to find knitwear that's specific to that time period. And so like that can also be kind of a part of the pulp culture part of it, is sort of either playing with or trying to reflect a specific time period.
The knitwear on Outlander is just so gorgeous. Like I just need to take a minute and just say, oh my goodness, it's just beautiful.
That's definitely something that pops up on my feeds a lot. Is people knitting from that book, and it's people who I don't think would even be into it as a pulp culture thing, but it's just so beautiful that they are all over that book.
Well, and it's interesting. There's sort of like, I mean, there's fandoms, but then there's like a big one recently, thinking about both pop culture and the pandemic, was Harry Styles' jacket, which like all of these teenagers learned to knit and crochet because it was so expensive, and then sold out so that they couldn't get this jacket that Harry Styles had worn on like a rehearsal of a thing. Like it wasn't even a show. It just was like, they saw it, they thought it was so cool, they couldn't buy it. Yeah, it's not my style. But like these 15-year-olds were like, I'm going to learn how to knit and crochet to make that jacket. And that gets into something that I think is really big, which is reverse engineering. So like we've talked a lot about the Outlander book, which is an official thing that's been put out by the show that's like, here's this scarf, here's how you make it. The opposite of that is that like fans just see something on the TV and say, I want to make that, and there isn't a pattern for it. And again, we're talking about like the math of knitting and like the skills that you have to learn to do it. Like people will just sit down and rewatch scenes over and over again until they can figure out what is the pattern, and then they reverse engineer it. And there's some really great examples of that. Like Knives Out, Chris Evans' sweater was a big one that there was suddenly like a few months after it, there was like hundreds of different versions of how to knit the Chris Evans sweater from Knives Out.
But even like Bernie Sanders mittens.
Bernie Sanders mittens were huge. And they weren't even knit. Like that was like, she takes old sweaters and turns them into mittens. So it was like, it wasn't even originally a knitting pattern. It was like a sewing thing. And everybody's like, but we'll figure out how to knit it. And I mean, I think sometimes knitters will get into hot water too. A big controversy is Firefly. I don't know if you guys know what happened with this, with Jane's hat from Firefly. So it's a legitimately ugly hat. It's like this orange and yellow hat with like a big tuft on the top and ear flaps. It's legitimately very ugly, but because of that, sort of became very beloved by the fandom. And so people would reverse engineer it and then show people how to make their own. But the Fox, who owns Firefly, started sending cease and desist letters to these like little craft shops, just being like, you can't sell it, it's our intellectual property, this hat. So I mean, there is sometimes that problem with the reverse engineering, is if you get popular enough, then sometimes people get that. But
I was going to say, I remember a couple years ago when the first season of Mandalorian came out. It came out, I think, in like November or something. So right, like peak Christmas holiday shopping time. And of course, they didn't come out with any toys for Baby Yoda because they didn't want anything to be spoiled on the show. So I do remember like that Christmas seeing online all these people had started knitting like their own versions of Baby Yoda to give to their kids or grandkids for Christmas, because you couldn't go to it would be like it would be like a year later before you would actually see any Baby Yoda stuff in stores. So that was when you mentioned that about kind of the reverse engineering. It's the first thing that popped into my mind.
Which I believe there's a pattern for Baby Yoda in that Star Wars knitting book that I referenced earlier.
So speaking of Star Wars, are there any particular fandoms that you see represented a lot in crafting? And why do you think they make a good fit?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've talked about a few of them. Outlander's huge. Star Wars is huge. Another one is Harry Potter is very big in knitting. Particularly, and this is sort of an interesting thing, is that a lot of the stuff that you could buy for Harry Potter was branded to look like merchandise. So if you wanted to get a scarf or a sweater, it would have like a Disney logo or like a logo on it. Whereas what people really wanted was something that looked more like what you would see in the show, which didn't have a logo and was just a thing that the actor might have been wearing. And so I think that became a big thing where people were trying to figure out their own ways. And so now there's tons of books about how to like knit your own Weasley sweater, like the really ugly kind of sweaters with your initial on it or things like that, because people wanted something that looked more like what they saw on screen and not what was reflected in the official merchandise.
When I went away to school, my grandmother knit me a scarf in my school colors, and which were basically burgundy and gold. And so I put on the scarf and everyone was like, what a lovely Gryffindor scarf. And I very indignantly would say, no, my grandmother made this for me. But yeah, it's that, it looks like something that someone would wear in the world of Harry Potter, as opposed to the stylized, commercialized product.
Doctor Who is another one that you see a lot of crafting stuff around. I mean, from the obvious, it was the Fifth Doctor that had the giant scarf. That's recreated a lot, but even just general Doctor Who patterned scarves and like TARDIS scarves, and less a recreation of stuff on the show and more just certain themes or dresses made out of fabric with like the TARDIS pattern all over it and stuff like that. People get really, really creative there. And comic books is another one that you see a lot of recreation from. I made a Wonder Woman shawl for my sister recently for her birthday. So there's a lot out there comic book wise too. I was surprised at how much actually when I went looking.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting distinction. Like sometimes there's things that are you trying to Outlander, like recreate something that's visible on screen. And then there's the things that are more like inspired by or for somebody who's a fan. Like I have a sweater that I knit that has the wallpaper pattern from Sherlock, which is very random. And like if people saw it, they probably wouldn't be like, that's the wallpaper pattern from Sherlock. But I know that that's what it is. And like fans of the show who saw me wearing it might recognize it. So I think that there's sometimes those things that are like, this is from the show. I'm being very in your face about it versus like, I just love it. And so I'm going to like find ways to recreate that in my own work.
Yeah, I was going to say, I know I've talked about my love of Bob's Burgers a lot on the show, but it's funny because like every now and then we'll be watching an episode and like, for example, there's an episode where Bob is absolutely obsessed with this kind of performance, kind of stomp type play called Cake. Or I think, is it Caken or Cake? I think it's just Cake. Yeah, so it's like patty cake basically, but it's like a version of Stomp. And we were watching that episode like a few weeks ago, and I was like, oh, that'd be awesome to have like the cake shirt that Bob's wearing. Of course, sure enough, you go online and somebody's made that shirt, but it's one of those things, like you said, Meg, where you're a fan of the show, and fans like, you know, kind of like hardcore fans will know what that is, but like the average person is like, that's weird. That guy's wearing a shirt that just says cake on it. The one, actually, speaking of Bob's Burgers, the one that I have seen online, and my wife Cheryl shared a lot, as she's noticed it on like Pinterest or Reddit or whatever, is there is what's it called? I think it's like called cross stitch, maybe. Yeah, it's cross stitch. So some people make stuff where it's like something from an animated show, like The Simpsons or Bob's Burgers, and I think those look really cool.
That's another one that I think got pretty big during the pandemic. I have one of my cousins, her husband suddenly got into like doing cross-stitch landscapes during the pandemic. And I was like, that's really random. But it was just like he was sitting around and he liked the outdoors. And so he was figuring out how to make that. And so, yeah, cross-stitch I think got really big too.
What do you think about how crafting or knitting, since you're both knitters, has been portrayed in pop culture?
So that podcast I referenced earlier, the crochet one, did talk about how like crochet is often seen as like a thing for low income families. Like it, and I don't know if that's historically that way. Can be like you can do it cheaply, but if you get really deep into a lot of crafts, they get expensive really fast. So it's almost a misnomer, but the thought of something handmade rather than store bought is now a luxury, whereas previously it was something you did to save money or something along those lines. So like they referenced the granny square Afghan from Roseanne. So that's a working class family. I guess it was very iconic to the point where they had to like attach it to the couch so that nobody would steal it, like on set. I think it signals certain things. Or you think of like Jess on New Girl, and she's middle class, but she's living somewhere that's very expensive to the point where she has to have multiple roommates. And she does a lot of various crafty things, partly because she enjoys them, but partly to fill certain needs that she has.
I do think that's an interesting thing too, where we sort of think about like fast fashion and how things have changed, where we think of like a hand knit garment, if you treat it right, can last like that, you know, blanket probably was made by someone's grandma and like has continued to be used for like generations. Whereas if you think of like a cheap blanket that you get from like Walmart or something, it's not going to last 20 years. So when you think about like the staying power of stuff, I think that's an interesting change to maybe how we used to think about, you're right, it was cheap because it was handmade. Or you think about the kids who used to, when I was a kid, go to school and you wanted the Ninja Turtles lunchbox branded one and not a brown paper bag or whatever it was that your, you know, mom made out of fabric. Like that was not the cool thing to do because it was handmade. It wasn't cool. Or the homemade Halloween costume versus a store-bought Halloween costume, I think is a good example. Whereas now I think we see the luxury of the time that a parent would put into that as like, oh, your mom made you a costume, that like that maybe elevates your social standing as opposed to what it might have been seen previously. So I think that is kind of an interesting change that has come.
And it's still primarily women being shown doing these things, even though yes, especially something like knitting, it is mostly women, but there are lots of men doing it, and I think it just kind of hurts the culture and white women too. That's the other thing, is there's not enough representation that actually shows the community.
I think, you know, older shows or movies, it's always like the grandma sitting in the corner knitting as well. She's in her rocking chair and she's just sitting there knitting. Occasionally she'll have the odd quip and she just goes back to minding her own business and knitting. So I definitely think there's probably still a little bit of that thought that, you know, knitting is kind of like an old person thing. But yeah, it definitely seems like there's been this change where it is a lot of younger people picking up this hobby?
I was just reading an article this morning about one of the actresses from a new NBC show, Rutherford Falls, and she was saying that it was important for her and her character to the earrings that she wore on the show were done by Indigenous artists, beadwork, and I think there were these pictures of them and they're beautiful, and I think that now we're starting to understand the time, the effort, the work that goes into creating things like that and really celebrating the history, the art, the connection to culture through pop culture as well. And that was really neat to see. Bryce, before we get to our roundtable questions, can you let everyone know what we'll be chatting about on our next episode, which will be available on Friday, June 4th?
So did you know that June is National Indigenous History Month? On the next episode, we're going to be shining the light on some titles from Indigenous authors that you might want to check out here at EPL. And joining us will be first-time guest Caitlin Miller, who will be sharing some of her picks with us. Caroline, I imagine you've got some picks all lined up for this next episode. And it'll be our first one in June. It should be a good one. All right, round table question time. Tell us about one piece of pop culture art or craft that you have in your house. Ashley.
Okay, so this is a little bit different kind of pulp culture, but I have a photo of the roof of a Burger Baron mounted in my hallway. My favorite burger place, pretty local to Alberta or the prairies. And my mom found it at a local arts and crafts show. I think it was Royal Bison, and immediately knew what it was because the logo is not on there, but some of them have pretty distinctive roofs, and knew she had to buy it for me for my birthday. So that's pretty fun. And a lot of people, our family in particular, we have a kind of connection with that burger place because of history. But everybody who walks into my place knows exactly what it is when they look at it.
That's awesome. Meg, how about you?
This was tough because a lot of the pop culture crafts I make, I give to people. So like I at one point had a Princess Leia hat where I had knit the buns onto a hat, but then I gave it to my sister. So it's not in my house anymore. So the best one that was in my house is I had a friend who made me She-Ra and He-Man silhouette shadow boxes, and they sit on either side of my television. They are legitimately the most awesome thing ever. And so that would have to be my favorite. Yeah.
After we're done recording here, Meg, can you send me a photo
I will take
of those?
pictures of them for you. Yes.
I am a growing kid of the 80s, huge Masters of the Universe fan, and She-Ra as well. So
for sure.
That sounds awesome. Caroline, how about you?
The hardest part was narrowing it down to which one I was going to talk about, but I landed on a poster that I have framed on the wall in my living room, and it is an incomplete visual guide to Degrassi Junior High and Degrassi High, 1987 to 1992, by an Edmonton based designer and artist named Nigel Hood, and it's a giant poster that has a separate icon for each episode of Degrassi Junior High and Degrassi High, from the first episode all the way up to the TV movie Schools Out. I love it. It's fun. It's really pops in my living room. It makes me happy when I look at it.
Caroline, we almost need to do a whole episode around the Schools Out special, because I think like a whole generation of Canadians literally just grew up as soon as they watched that episode.
During that episode. Yeah.
100%.
It is that movie is transformational.
It is.
So,
it really is.
Yeah. What about you, Bryce?
So similar to Ashley, I actually have it's artwork in my house that actually I also got from Royal Bison. A couple of people at EPL, it's funny because they had both texted me on the same day, and they're like, hey, you have to check this out because I know you're into this stuff. And basically it was 4 prints, and it's from a local designer here in Edmonton called Hotel Design Co. And they kind of came out with these 4 prints featuring past Stampede wrestling stars. So like you'd have everything from like, of course you have like your Hart family on there, but you'd have like characters from the 80s like Jason the Terrible, or guys from like, you know, the 60s like Stan Stasiak. So as a kind of a who's who history of Stampede wrestling. And big shock, I do have them framed and they're up in kind of like my gaming room here at my place. So yeah, they're kind of tucked away that so I can enjoy them.
Hotel Design Co. Real name Nigel Hood.
Oh,
the same guy who did my Degrassi poster, which I bought at Royal Bison. So this episode not brought to you by Royal Bison, but not a surprise that there's a tie-in there.
All right, last question. There have been TV shows about glass blowing, baking, flower arranging, and woodworking. What do you think should be the next big artsy or crafty reality TV show? Meg?
So as I was saying at the beginning, I think that there's some really cool paper craft stuff happening with like Cricuts and stuff like that. And I think one of the things that I see a lot of YouTube videos, maybe this is just because what I watch, is like miniatures where people like do a miniature version of a TV show or a miniature of a kitchen or something like that out of sort of like making little miniature doll houses. And I think that would be a really cool show where you could have people like, because it can take hours and hours to get the scale right and to like represent these little worlds. So I think that would be a really cool, I mean, I'm sure people will be freaking out and it's the wrong size and this isn't the right print of paper, and like you could get a lot of drama out of it, but I think you could find some really cool things that people have represented in those kind of miniature worlds.
Ashley, how about you?
This was a really tough one for me because everything I thought of was like, no, they don't have the time for that. Like something like knitting or crocheting, you can't whip something up in a couple hours that's any decent sort of size. No, it wouldn't work. So I love the idea of the miniature one. And now they have miniature food. Have you ever seen the videos of people making tiny little food? It's fascinating. So something like that might be fun. Or and this maybe already exists, but Lego building, but less building structures, but building art. So going the more artistic side, like the glass blowing ones did, where you actually have professionals who work in that medium creating stuff. I think that I feel like probably takes hours and hours and hours to plan, but you could put together in a reasonable amount of time, which I think a lot of those shows, they're not telling you that they have way more time to plan than they actually do, but they can pull something together in a few hours or a couple days.
There is a show on Fox. I think it's coming back this summer. I don't know the name of it. I saw a promo for it the other night though, but it has something to do with Lego building, so I don't know all the rules behind it, but yeah, we'll have to watch for it. We'll try and find it for our show notes. Mm-hmm. Caroline, how about you?
I love the idea of miniatures, so think that might actually get my vote, but I went in the opposite direction of large scale outdoor murals. Because it's one of these ones where you watch it and you're kind of lulled into the sense of, I could do that. What I could do it. And then you see someone with a bit of like varying skill level, and you see a really well done one and maybe one that needed a bit more time, and you think, oh yeah, I probably couldn't do that. So yeah, just really nice large scale outdoor murals, right?
I think for me, it's funny because like during the pandemic, of course, we see on the news and other places all the time, it's like people being interviewed from home, and they have these lovely bookshelves set up or stuff in the background. I would love to see some sort of like reality or competition where it's basically like somebody's got to come in. So think of like organizing, and they have a bookshelf, you don't know, and maybe they have boxes, and basically somebody's got to go in, take a look at what's in the box and design like a really aesthetically or pleasing, like something very pleasing to the eye, where you design like a really cool looking like bookshelf or our collection that way. So that would be my show.
That would be fun if you did it like Trading Spaces style, where like you did each other's and then you had to come in and be like horrified by like what your friend or neighbor thought your background should look like.
Thank you so much, both of you, for joining us today. Is there anything coming up at EPL that you would like to let people know about?
Well, for me, on June 18th, we're having a song and story concert on Crowdcast. And that's going to be some local musicians talking about their process in writing songs, singing songs. And it's going to be a great chance to sort of hear some local musicians. And we're going to be sharing it with some of our Edmonton residents in long-term care who are a bit isolated, but it's also open to members of the public who maybe just want to feel like you're doing something together with some local folks. So I definitely would recommend checking that out, and it'll be on EPL's Crowdcast page.
Ashley, do you have anything?
Yeah. So if you are a teacher in Edmonton at an Edmonton school, we are still taking bookings for presentations to your class. So there's a few options, including a pre-recorded thing where we just send you a link and it introduces them to the library and what you can do there. And there's some options for how long you want it to be or what you want it to cover. And then our librarians are also doing live Information Ninjas presentations. So that's a lot around information literacy, how to use EPL resources to find information for your classes for research. It covers a lot of different things, including how to suss out what is fact and what is fiction on the internet, which I know the Adult Services team just did a program along that for adults, but we also do a similar type presentation for kids for the ages grades 3 to 6, junior high and high school. We have 3 separate presentations. So to book that, you just go to our webpage, and under the educators page, there's a form you can fill out to request a presentation. So.
Yeah, we also have a newsletter that's specially geared for teachers and educators, and we'll have a link to that in our item list as well. We hope you've enjoyed today's episode. Make sure that you're subscribed so that you automatically get all of our new episodes. Please also leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. We love getting reviews. And as always, if you like what you hear, please tell a friend about the show.